Welcome back to TAC Ops. I'm here with Eric.
Howdy, howdy.
And I'm Greg. I forgot to say that. But today we're going to have on Larry Bond, a legend in terms of this whole genre, all the stuff that we talk about. But first, we have our sponsor, the Commando Store. They are an online military surplus store. And they have everything. Eric, you have it pulled up here. They have a Independence Week sale going on.
Yeah,
Day
definitely.
6.
So last week we were talking about them. They have these custom-made waxy boots that you can buy. And I guess today's the last day to do it.
Today's the last day.
Yeah, so make sure you head over there, get your last chance for some custom-made waxy boots. They also got 10% off night vision goggles. So if you guys need some night vision.
It's a monocular, too. It's not the other one they had was on that you'd fit onto a scope or onto a rifle.
Right.
This one is actually a monocular.
Yeah, here's the other one down here. So this is the actual monocle, and you can see it on the helmet. It's pretty
That's
slick.
very cool. I wonder if they have the helmet too.
Yeah, definitely. If you got $2,400 sitting around, definitely check that out. And got some cool T-shirts. And then this is the other site. So this is that refurbed police trade-in. I guess it has this little bitty defect right here. So
Yeah, they probably have minor defects, so
yeah,
they got to get rid of them.
but this is the actual gun-mounted site, so you can see it actually goes on.
To the Picatinny rail.
Yeah, it goes on top of a rail. So they definitely got all your backpacking needs. They got some coffee beans and stuff, and then the dry goods. I think they're giving away.
A PPE pump.
Yeah, everybody's giving away
Hand sanitizer?
hand sanitizer.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we didn't know what this was, but we thought it was pretty cool. We just show you guys. I don't know what boy bathwater is, but it's something with a gun shell in it. I don't know what this is at all.
Yeah.
But anyways, they're a cool sponsor. We want you guys to go check them out.
They always have this funky stuff, and then they always have all the typical stuff, all the different boots and hats and clothing articles and all that stuff. So go over and check them out. Commando Store. Commando is spelled with a K. Store.com. And you get 5% off with our coupon code TACOPS.
Definitely.
No space in between that. All right, Mr. Bond, thanks for being on.
Please, I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to it.
Maybe we can, oops, I almost dropped that. Maybe we can start out with your background a little bit. I understand, so you served in the Navy for 6 years, and then went on to create Harpoon and all these, and an author. You want to tell us how you got started with all that?
I'll say up front, it was dumb luck, heavy on the dumb. But I grew up in Minnesota, joined the Navy in 1975. Originally, I was selected for Pensacola, but my eyes weren't good enough, so I ended up going surface warfare because I'd already seen enough to know that I liked the Navy and wanted to serve. And what I did was go through Austin Canadian School, went to my first ship, which was USS McKean, DD-784. She was built in 45, did not serve in World War II. Another ship in our squadron actually carried 2 Japanese flags on her director, which was a little embarrassing when the Datsun Marus would pull up in the next period and load their latest shipment of cars. But that's neither here nor there.
Hey, Larry, I don't mean to cut you off, but you got like a really bad echo going. It sounds like you're talking twice.
Let me turn down my speaker.
All right.
It might be, are you watching the stream live on YouTube as well?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, maybe turn that on mute just so that's not playing.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was. It was like 10 seconds delayed.
You're right. That's what it is. How do I mute the? Let's see. I'm not used to muting this. I can mute my computer speaker, but I don't know how to mute.
Oh
this.
yeah. So if you go on the YouTube the video,
yeah,
the bottom left hand, if you just mouse over the video, it should pop up with the play button and all that. They'll have that little speaker button.
Oh, that's how you do it.
Yep. All right. Sorry about that. What do you mean to slow your roll?
Hang on. Let's see here.
See, even game developers have some
You know
issues
what?
with social media.
Turn it off. I'll just have to trust you guys aren't putting up pictures of me that I don't know about.
Oh no, just some good old ones of you.
We have some risque photos that we found here.
Yeah, really. Okay, to start again, I joined the Navy, loved it, got on board a ship. I was in Seattle, Washington. Wonderful place to be. Served for 2 years as electronics officer, which meant I learned about radar and electronic warfare and lots of cool stuff. Then for the last 2 years, I was anti-submarine warfare officer, which of course the captain described as his main battery, ASROC and torpedoes. And so I don't know how it is for submariners. I mean, you guys, when the skipper is on the periscope, well, it's always one-man control. But normally destroyers are more of a team effort except for ASW. What happens there is if we're chasing a submarine, I'm in underwater battery fire control plot with the sound-powered phones on. The captain steps away, the tactical action officer and CIC steps away. I've got a direct line to the conning officer on the bridge, and I'm driving the ship. Everybody else lets me take the lead, and I'm driving the ship and chasing that submarine all over the ocean. And I got to tell you, that is a hoot. That is serious fun. I got to do it once, twice while I was in, and the full up pursuit thing, and it was great. Learned a lot. After that, after I left the ship, I went to a short duty at Center for Naval Analyses in Washington, D.C., and studied naval topics, worked with some amazingly smart people like Peter Perla and Brad Dismukes and others. Learned a lot. I was a lieutenant at a place where captains are getting coffee for these amazingly intelligent guys. And I mean, everybody else on my research team had a doctorate, and I'm a lieutenant with a BA or in computer science, and I loved it. I loved it so much, in fact, that I got out of the Navy and kept doing analysis, and I was working on a war game to take advantage of some stuff that I learned while I was in the fleet. There was a game called NavTag, which was in the fleet for training and was very popular, very well received, but it had problems. One was that all the information in it was based on official Navy sources and was classified secret. So it was hard to make copies, leave it out for people to play. It always had to be locked up in my safe. That's no way to play a game. I wrote a game that was unclassified and had a simpler game system that was easier for naval officers who are not familiar with wargaming to understand and play. We played several versions, several games of that on the ship. It was very well received by the captain. And the captain says, I'm going to send you to a place where they do that full time. And so I went to Center for Naval Analyses. And then I kept on doing that in the civilian world. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, a young insurance salesman in rural Maryland bought a copy of my published Harpoon game and used it as one of his many data sources on a novel he was working on about Russian submarines. And it was called The Hunt for Red October. And Tom Clancy wrote a letter to me with questions about naval warfare. I answered the letter, which is why I always answer my mail. And we ended up becoming very fast friends. Tom was amazingly smart, really good at putting two and two together, and was a hell of a storyteller, needless to say. I was there. I got to read Hunt while it was still in manuscript. I made a few comments on naval terminology. Is it right hard rudder or hard right rudder? That type of thing. Tom gave me a very nice gong in the front of the book for that, and I deeply appreciate that. And we're doing stuff, and just hanging out together. And I was working on a war game about the convoys, which in the 80s, there was a huge question about whether the Russians would try and sink the convoys that were supposed to be taking all the supplies to Europe if the Russians attacked. Operation Reforger. And they talked about the Central Front scenario and how important these convoys were and would the Russians try and interfere. I was working on a war game that talked about that. And I was blathering on to Tom about it, and it was really huge. I mean, hundreds of ships treating the Atlantic Ocean as a single basin for sensors, things like that. And Tom said, that would make a good book. I said, really? Which is where my education in writing books started. And he said, "Do you want to work on it with me?" And I thought about it, and I said, "Yes." And we wrote Red Storm Rising. I was his apprentice. I worked to research topics. We went and visited different defense installations. Of course, Tom was treated like a king. His hunt was out and huge, and everybody liked the fact that Tom was being accurate and faithful to not only the hardware, but the service people involved, and getting a read on the individuals and their character. So often, there was still a lot of anti-military sentiment in the early 80s. And the fact that we were not out to grind any axes, but just tell an exciting story, really opened a lot of doors for us. That's a long answer to the question of how I got involved with Tom Clancy. Are you good so far? Questions?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, Red Storm Rising was such a huge hit. And Tom went on from there. We remained close after that. I did not work with him again on another book. I was still writing and developing Harpoon and other war games. And I ended up, I paired up with another guy, is the best way to describe it, Pat Larkin, and I wrote a bunch of books with him. Red Phoenix was my first. I learned how to do it from Tom, and if you're going to learn from the master.
Yeah.
So now I was the senior partner. Pat was the junior partner, and we came out with 5 books, which all did very well. And then Pat and I parted ways. I picked up another co-author, Chris Carlson, my good friend. Now, Chris was one of the first guys to comment on Harpoon when it was first published, and wrote me a letter with some questions and corrections about submarines, because I was a surface driver and he knew more about submarines. So he filled me in on a bunch of stuff. I still remember one of them was submarines are pigs on the surface and you don't reflect that in the game. I said, how often are they surfaced? Well, we still have to show the real thing. We've been close friends and partners for over 40 years now. And when Chris first started collaborating with me about Harpoon in 1996, and about that same time he said, hey, let's work on a book together. And that became the Jerry Mitchell series, which was supposed to end after 4 and ended up going through 6 books. The latest of those is Fatal Thunder, which has been Arctic Gambit, which has been out for a while now. I tend to lose track. Apologies.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited about that one. I actually bought that this morning. It's going to be here next week. Can't wait. I like the premise of the Arctic Gambit because it talks about Status 6 and the USS Toledo and some other stuff like that. And like Red Storm Rising, just the whole gambit of everything you do definitely seems very submarine heavy. I was curious about your time in serving on a destroyer. Did you ever have to tangle with any? I know you were talking about a little bit about it, but is that kind of what helped motivate you to write a bunch of the submarine books, or did you actually get to go out and do anything on them, or like what kind of gave you the motivation for the submarine side of it?
Well, it's 2 things. While Tom did a great job of just making people aware about submarines with Hunt for Red October, he sort of left them behind after when he got into the Jack Ryan series. Wrote some great stories. They just didn't happen to be about submarines. And what we wanted to do with the Jerry Mitchell series was talk more about the culture and talk more about the guys that are on board and doing their job in a maybe, I don't want to say normal situation, because our characters are always involved in life-threatening crisis skirting activity. Action. It's all very exciting and designed to deprive all the readers of a decent night's sleep. But there was more to show, I guess, is what I wanted to say. And what we did with the Jerry Mitchell series is talk about life aboard a submarine. Eric, did you ever go north of the Arctic Circle? Did you do a Blue Nose ceremony?
Yes, I did the ISEX in 2004, so I got a good piece of that Blue Nose ceremony. It was one of the most.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of stuff that we want to talk about. I mean, obviously, the first thing we did was we put a couple of newbies, in this case, 2 women, on a submarine in dangerous ground, which of course you're not supposed to do, but writers get to break the rules. Yep. And then we worked with that and had them on a very atypical mission, and the Russians ended up chasing them, and luckily, we all survived. And then we took the character Jerry Mitchell, so sort of think Horatio Hornblower, but with nuclear submarines. He's facing a different situation in Cold Choices, where now he's the navigator, and guess what? They're in a collision, and the other boat was a Russian, and it turns out they're the only ones that can help that Russian guy, but you got all the Cold War mentality stuff going on. Well, that's no good. And then in the next one, he's now up to XO, and he's involved in something in the Persian Gulf. And I don't want to give a lot of it away, but we take him outside his comfort zone. It's the best way to describe it, an exit plan. And then you go on from there. Shattered Trident, he's a full captain, and he's doing different things. Fatal Thunder is more nuclear threat. And then Arctic Gambit, the latest one, is more almost current day. I didn't. We were frankly reacting to the news we heard about this Russian, what used to be called the Status 6, and I guess the Russians now call it the Poseidon. I mean, who but the Russians would come up with a torpedo, a huge torpedo? I mean, the thing is like 6 feet in diameter. It goes 100 knots at 100 fathoms and has a huge nuclear warhead, and is basically unkillable. It's nuts. On the other hand, they did it. It's not. I mean, when I first heard about it, I thought somebody was making stuff up, and I thought they'd been we're just putting out noise. And then no, it's real. That's a real thing. Holy crap! Pardon my French.
Yeah, that and the Skyfall weapon, has been kind of on the news lately because apparently they had some radiation leak here. Let me pull it up. I got so many things open right now. They had a radiation leak. Oh man, I think I may have lost it. Here it is. No. Oh god, I got so much stuff.
You have all of H.S. Sutton's work.
I got every Sutton page open right now because I use it. But anyway, I'll have to find it. Sorry, guys. They actually found some. They had a radiation leak somewhere near Finland. I guess they picked it up, and Sutton and everybody were believing that it could have been the Skyfall missile or the Poseidon weapon because the academic research ship was sitting right over it, and they don't believe it was Skyfall because they didn't shut air traffic down. Generally, they'd shut the air traffic and have no-fly zones over it. So because there were no-fly zones, they think it was maybe them testing this thing. I don't know why it leaked. I don't think it's supposed to leak. The reactors aren't supposed to leak because I'm pretty sure these are sealed.
Well, I mean, this thing is a weird weapon to begin with. I mean, let's talk about the Poseidon for just a minute. First of all, it's not a first strike weapon. And people get very, very scared. Oh my God, we got this the Russians have this horrible weapon. And the only reason the Russians developed the Poseidon is because they're scared to death we're going to be able to field a successful anti-ballistic missile, which would be destabilizing. Yep. If we can shoot down their nukes, then they're not able to present a credible deterrent. Now, this Poseidon sounds terrible, and it the kind of damage it would do is unimaginable. But it's a second strike weapon. First of all, if they launch the thing, 100 knots is very fast, but it takes a while to get from wherever the ship is, wherever the sub is that's launching this thing, to its target. And by the way, while it's doing that, it's about as noisy as a teenager's stereo. It's like a cement mixer underwater. And everybody's going to go, holy crap, they launched one. And it's not a very, you cannot launch a sneak attack with a Poseidon. So what they're doing with it is they're saying, you can shoot down our ballistic missiles. but we'll still finish you off because we can launch this Poseidon. And by the way, once it's launched, we don't have any way of stopping this thing or interfering with it or decoying it or anything. And this is their guaranteed second strike deterrent. The same way that we have ballistic missile submarines out there. Right. I mean, that was the original reason for having the Polaris boats and everything else. We would, if the Russians launched a sneak attack somehow, managed to nuke everything, the Polaris boats would still be able to launch. That's your deterrent, your mutually assured destruction. This is just them preserving that mutually assured destruction from their side. So it's strategically, it's a defensive weapon. If you want to bend your mind around that concept.
Yeah, it always made sense. That's how I always thought about it. You know, Bush and the U.S. pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. What was it, 2003, 2002, around there. So they were worried the U.S. was going to develop, you know, a new version of Star Wars or something that can make ballistic missiles, you know, a thing of the past. And it ended up being a much more limited thing. Now we just have that GBI, you know, in Alaska there that can really only defend against missiles pretty much coming from North Korea. That's about it. You know, nowhere near enough to stop a full-out strike. But, you know, that gave Russia 15 years about, 2003, 2002 to now. And that makes sense that maybe they started designing these things around that time.
Well, they have to be looking at what we're doing, especially with the Navy in terms of, and the Army for that matter, with anti-tactical ballistic missiles. I mean, you've got Patriot and THAAD that are shooting down Scuds. The U.S. Navy is very interested, and I believe, is very capable of shooting down Chinese ballistic missiles aimed at our ships, the DF-21 and 26. I mean, we have the SM-6 that is fully ATBM capable.
Yeah.
And if you're talking long term, and the Russians are looking long term, just as we should be, and often don't, they're saying the U.S. could leverage that technology to quickly develop the next level of ballistic missile defense, which could be canister-based missiles capable of shooting down ICBMs all over the country. I mean, we could field that if we really wanted to in a strategically short period of time. And that's got them scared. I mean, the Russians, so much of their strategy is oriented around defense, the bastion in the Northern Sea, or Norwegian Sea, and the Barents. Totally defensive. And so I get where they're coming from with the Poseidon completely. But still, it's a secure platform.
Well, what do you make of the other way around? What if Russia, like you were saying, Russia is very focused on defense. They have, like you said, the bastions and everything constantly. And then they have air defense systems. Like the U.S., we really don't have any permanently deployed air defense systems at all anymore. They're all mobile, like the Patriot sites. They'll go deploy them somewhere, then bring it back. Whereas if you look through Russia, if you look at satellite imagery, Google Earth even, you'll find, those S-300, S-400 sites permanently set up, completely surrounding Moscow, completely surrounding, St. Petersburg and Vladivostok and every other city there. Have you read much about their new system, their own THAAD, the S-500?
Well, Prometheus?
Yes.
Yeah, that thing is very capable. They are quickly leaving us behind in terms of the ability to deploy a very capable air defense systems. I mean, it's not only the S-500, which is the top tier, but they have lower tier systems which tactically can link in, like the Pantsir, the Tor, those short range defensive systems can all be networked together and deployed and put up to protect, for instance, their operations in Syria, which is what they're doing now. If they're misused or not used properly, they can be destroyed. We've seen Pantsir units being destroyed by
Israel. Yeah,
Yeah. So they're not invulnerable, but their stuff is very capable. The Russians have always been much more interested in air defense than us, in part because they're close. They have, potentially hostile neighbors, potentially hostile. Thank goodness. No shooting going on right now, please, and much closer to their borders, and they've been invaded. You don't forget that easily, and I'm not sure that those S-300 or S-400 sites ringing Moscow are fully combat ready, but they're kind of playing belt and suspenders there, and plus they're now selling those S-300, 400, 500 SAM systems abroad, and that's useful foreign exchange for them. They like
Turkey.
And that's an issue. I think the Turks really put their thumb in our eye with that purchase. And of course, now they're losing the F-35, but so that almost hurts us more than them, since they were one of the helping to spread out the cost.
Yeah, I've always thought that was definitely an area where the U.S. lagged behind, is air defense, especially short-range air defense, like Panzer and all that. We don't have really anything like that at all.
No.
I mean, we got rid of... we have Avenger still. What was the other one? Chaparral, we got rid of that. We got rid of pretty much any automated AAA systems. They kind of brought it back with Phalanx. They have the Centurion. But that's still very, very limited.
Well, there's some great shots on YouTube of Phalanx air defense stuff over in Iraq or somewhere, shooting down incoming rockets and stuff. But we don't have anything, and I don't know if it's because the last time we tried with the DIVAD, it was such an abysmal failure, or we've just got other things we want to spend our money on. There's always priorities, and air defense. I mean, luckily we've always enjoyed air superiority wherever we're fighting. I mean, the last time it was seriously contested was Korea, but even there we eventually. I mean, we now not only use the term air superiority, but air supremacy, as if being superior isn't enough. We're now supreme. There's no other airplane daring to fly, and someday that may come back to bite us.
Yeah, it was interesting you mentioned about the Navy. The Navy seems to be the foremost, much more ahead of the Army, which makes sense because our Navy ships, the U.S. is thousands of miles away from anyone who's a potential adversary at this point. Maybe that's starting to change with a couple different places, but essentially. But then you have the aircraft carriers forward deployed, so they have a whole bunch of defenses. You were talking about the SM-6, the SM-2, obviously, and then Sea Sparrow, the Phalanx, all that stuff, the rolling airframe missile.
Yeah, it's layered air defense. I mean, bottom line in naval warfare, a surface threat is now an air threat because those surface ships are going to fire missiles at you. They don't get close enough to fire guns. Of course, aircraft are coming in. They're either going to attack directly or fire their own standoff missiles or tactical missiles. So 2/3, in fact, I would say the most dangerous 2/3 is always going to be coming from the air. Now, you've still got to worry about torpedoes and the submarine threat, but there's really not much that comes in the way of what used to be the classic surface gun engagement. So and believe me, we've been working like crazy on the new Harpoon game to work on that air defense whole issue because there's a lot of stuff going on and things happen so quickly with air defense that if you don't get it right the first time, you're screwed.
Yeah, that's something that was brought up a lot in Red Storm Rising with the Badgers and the backfires coming in to attack.
That was in World War II, 400 knots was bad. Now it can be 600 knots. It can be 1,300 knots. There are now supersonic anti-ship missiles out there, and let's not even talk about hypersonics. That's a different issue entirely.
And that's another thing, too, I've always been interested in wondering. The U.S. doesn't really have, Russia built these big, large, supersonic anti-ship missiles where the U.S. is still, obviously with the Harpoon. Like that's pretty much it. We've had that since the 70s, late 70s, and that's pretty much been it for the most part. Surface launch.
Well, again, this is because we usually enjoyed naval supremacy and didn't have a great surface threat until the Chinese started building up their fleet. The Harpoon was probably enough to get the job done, but the Chinese are fielding missiles now with much greater range than the Harpoon. Now we're fielding very quickly as we possibly can, this new long-range anti-ship missile, which will really up the capabilities of us to engage surface targets, other surface ships. We haven't had a lot of surface ships to engage.
True.
Remember that I said the main threats were air and submarine. We've been concentrating on air defense and ASW. Now all of a sudden we've got to get back in the surface game because of China, and we'll build up our capabilities in that area quickly, I hope.
Yeah. How would you? So obviously you do some programming and everything with Harpoon. How effective? So the missile you mentioned, that LRASM, long range anti-ship missile. So it's a stealthy missile. Now these are already sea skimming, so you're not even going to see it, regardless of whether or not it's stealthy, until it's over the horizon, which is going to be 20 kilometers away or somewhere around there, right? Is stealth really helping you out that much there?
Absolutely. Stealth works in a couple different ways, but let me back up one step. Talk about all the things you can do to make a missile better for attacking a ship. I mean, the Russians went with long range and big warheads, so you wouldn't need a lot of warheads to hit, especially if you happen to mix in a couple nukes with all the conventional stuff, and high speed to close on the target properly. We decided instead to go with some. I mean, the problem is, if you're talking about ship design, it's ship impact. If you put a bunch of SSN-3 Shaddix or SSN-19 Granites on a ship, that takes up a lot of space. Yep. We went with a small missile, the Harpoon, and put it right down next to the water. The thing cruises like, I don't want to say 10 feet's the accurate number, but it seems that low. Yeah. And it's down there in the waves. And so the Russians aren't going to see it until it's very, very close. On the other hand, we can see the backfires and those huge cruise missiles that they launch coming from the middle of next week. The problem we've got is shooting them all down.
Yeah.
So Harpoon goes for the Velo, and the Russians are now fielding that class of weapon as well. The Ka-35 Uran is their equivalent to a Harpoon. They call it the Harpoonski.
Yeah.
And form follows function there, and they've got other follow-on weapons. The Chinese have similar weapons, and the French actually pioneered it with Exocet.
True.
But we follow with Harpoon. I mean, they're out there now. Okay, so he's down low, so that cuts the radar horizon. The next thing you do is you make him stealthy, so that even when he comes over the radar horizon, you're not going to see him right away. The other thing stealth does for you is it makes it harder for weapons to lock on. Okay, if you got a smaller radar signature, your phalanx, your air defense weapons are not going to see them. That's why the Russians are trying to make their stuff stealthy as well. The LRASM is stealthy. Now there's other things you can do. I mean, all anti-ship missiles have most have a radar seeker. Some have an infrared seeker. The Norwegians like to use infrared. Mm-hmm. But let's take your vanilla infrared seeker on a cruise missile coming in on a ship. It activates 5 miles, 10 miles, maybe farther away from the ship. It sees a radar image in front of it. It's got a bunch of blips. It usually just goes for the largest blip. Now you can do things to say bias it to one side or the other, but you can't say I want to go for the ship in the center of that formation, the one that they're trying to protect.
Interesting.
Until you get to a really advanced radar, like an ESA radar, that we're now capable of fielding. those radar seekers, you can do things electronically, so you're actually looking at images of ships. And even if it's not a perfect image, if you can just get the length of the ship and figure out its course and speed, you can, okay, so you've got apparent length, course and speed adjusted by trig. Boom, you know how long that ship is. That feeds into a database in the seeker's memory, and it says, that's the ship I'm supposed to attack. It's almost like dialing in chicken and roadrunner and owl on the side of the missile. And so you can pick a particular ship. And that targeting ability is good. Now, beyond that, ESA radar also allows you to do what's called low probability of intercept, which means it's sending a signal out, and then maybe it doesn't need to send a signal out again for a little while, and then it sends another one out. And the signal
shift frequencies too, right?
Yeah, it shifts frequencies. It does things to the signal, so it looks more random. And so their electronic warfare and jammers have problems countering it, and they don't necessarily see it right away. So the seeker can, I mean, when Russian missile seekers come on, I was trained as an electronic warfare officer. I said, this is what they're going to look like, and this is what you do to deal with them, to try and jam them. And you can't do that anymore. Their latest stuff has some LPI capability, and LRASM will also have that LPI capability. So now it's doubly hard to shoot down, as well as being harder to spot. And of course, it goes boom when it hits you.
Yeah, I know they talked about having artificial intelligence built into it, and that would make sense. You're talking about with the infrared seeker, where it actually can discriminate between different ships.
Guys, we're okay. I mean, this sounds science fictiony and very cutting edge, but actually, AI has been in seekers since the 80s. The Russians on their Granit, the SSN-19. That had what's called a scout mode. Now, let's say they pick up a target and they launch a salvo of 8 missiles. And by the way, if you're fighting a naval battle, you don't launch 1 or 2. You launch a salvo of basically everything you've got, because he's going to shoot some of those guys down on the way in, and you want to make sure you get a hit. So let's say he launches 8. That is the load on I forget. Okay, anyways, one of those missiles is going to fly a little bit higher than the others. Okay, the other 7 are down in the weeds. You've got one up there, and it flies up that high because it's got a higher radar horizon. So it's going to see just a little bit farther than the rest of the salvo. Now they're headed in the general direction of the enemy. It will sit there and first listen passively to see if it can detect enemy radars that it's been programmed to look for. If it doesn't see anything, it will then activate its own radar seeker to look for the enemy. And then when it finds something, either passively or actively, it will send the information down to the other 7. And then they'll decide among themselves who they're going to attack.
That's fascinating.
And it almost sounds like a cartoon, but they do this. And by the way, if that one missile gets shot down, the scout that's up a little higher because it's more exposed, another one will rise up to take its place. And every time I read about this, I just go, clever, those Russians. This is scary stuff. So that was the 80s. What capabilities do they have? What capabilities do we have now? What are they not telling us about, darn it?
Do you think there really is? I mean, I know a lot of people say that, but I always think, people say, people take it to the ultimate extreme, saying the U.S., the military has UFOs and aliens and all that stuff, right? All this secret technology. I don't know. Maybe I just don't have that high of an opinion of. I don't think they really have too much hidden there. I mean, nothing that private industry doesn't already have that we already know about. Like we were talking about, they're still operating the Harpoon from the 70s in a lot of these cases. Do you think any of that stuff is really deployed already?
It's the secret weapons always remain secret until they're actually needed, and there's a risk in employing them. I mean, especially in such a technological situation. In some of my games, I will have I will add a okay, they just parked this van on your helicopter deck, so you can't launch helicopters. And by the way, it does things to Russian communications, and we can't tell you what, but just go and have a nice day. Never mind, nothing to see here. And then the players are forced to deal with this unknown. Well, how's it going to help us? Well, we can't tell you that. Well, how's it going to work? Well, we've never tried it before, but I think a lot of the current technology can be leveraged or adapted to some fairly sneaky stuff if you've got creative people back there in those back offices figuring out, hey, we can do this with it. And witness computer viruses like Stuxnet.
Oh yeah.
Witness, Israelis are legendary for taking commercially available technology and doing bizarre stuff with it. And hopefully they're actually sharing some of that with their friends like us. Or we're also capable of coming up with a few clever ideas on our own. Again, we aren't going to find out about stuff until it's actually used successfully.
Sure.
And sometimes you see stuff flashily displayed. The F-117. Nobody ever heard of that thing until Desert Storm, and then all of a sudden, holy crap! It's a super weapon. Although only within certain very limited areas. You don't want to send that thing into a dogfight. But if you're striking a radar site, that's the plane you're going to use.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to. I talked to a couple different people. One guy works on an F-22. One guy on an F-35. A couple other things too, and they won't tell me what's going on. But he'll say, we have to get ready we got a new system that's going to be deployed on Station 12 or something like that. And he doesn't know what it is either, and he doesn't tell me anything classified. But you do hear some of that stuff, and even with the submarines too. There was, I think it was a leak from China that the U.S. was going to be deploying. They thought it might be SM-6 onto a submarine or some sort of laser. And Sea Dragon or something. What was it called? Do you remember that?
I don't remember a laser.
It was some, and no one could really understand why would you want to deploy like an SM-6, a standard missile on a submarine, or even a laser. What are you going to do with a laser in a submarine, unless you go up to periscope depth and maybe shoot down a helicopter coming after you? I'm not sure, but a lot of interesting stuff going on behind the scenes.
I've seen a lot of stuff. It's interesting. Back when I paid more attention to what was going on while I was still a naval analyst, civilian, before I quit my day job, we used to get something called the CBR, Congressional Budget Record, something like that. It would list all these different contracts that were being let, and you'd see this contract being let for research into neutrino communications, or submarine. It would be something like submarine mobility. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't move already? What are they going to do? And you hear stories about, well, they tried putting this lubricant on the outside of a submarine hull to make it go faster, and it didn't work. But they tried that, and they won't tell you. They will never tell you about the stuff that actually works. Why would they do that?
Yeah.
Unless they need to, because it's going to be deployed. Everybody's going to see it. Yeah.
Or a lot of times they'll even want to tell you when it doesn't work either, because
right.
Let the Chinese and Russians spend their money and figure out it doesn't work for themselves.
Right.
Well, that's Hunt for Red October. We could. By the way, I'll tell you a story about Hunt for Red October. I was still working at Center for Naval Analyses when the book came out, and one of the guys that I knew and worked with was very pleased to meet. It was a naval analyst named Stan Golick. Now, Stan went way back. He was into his 60s, although that's a little scary because that means he's younger than I am right now. When he looked like an old farmer. Okay, I'm sorry. and he had been in the Polish cavalry in World War II. Okay, this guy I wish I had been a writer back then. He was in the Polish cavalry, got out of Poland after the Germans attacked, made his way to the UK, served in the Royal Navy, was torpedoed on a Murmansk run, survived that, and went into naval architect, became a naval architect after the war. And he was involved in racing speedboats and other things. And he was working at CNA as a naval architect. And he talked about the Caterpillar drive that that Tom had in the book. He said the only thing wrong with the design was that it wouldn't be a low frequency rumble, it would be a high frequency rumble because the propellers were so small. He said that other than that, Tom had it locked. Wow. But yeah, the Stan Golick was a fun guy to talk to because he'd tell you all this stuff about the Polish army in World War II and just then the Royal Navy and serving in the Arctic Ocean on a Royal Navy destroyer. Yikes!
Yeah, no way.
Yeah, at least you were under Eric. You were under the water.
Yeah, going overboard is no joke, man. Especially you're in water like that, make you start gasping and stuff. You can't breathe. Oh, no way. Nope.
He was a commissioned officer, and was when his ship was torpedoed. He's pretty sure it was by a German acoustic torpedo because it hit right at the stern where the props were, which unfortunately is where officer's country was. So his end of the ship went down first, but he obviously survived. Tough guy. Amazing story. Fun guy.
I have to bounce back from that one.
I know.
Holy cow, he's good. That's man. I couldn't imagine surviving something like that.
I've met some amazing guys at Center for Naval Analysis and elsewhere, and that's been so much fun. Chris Carlson, the guy who I work with, because he wrote me a letter. Another reason why I like to answer my mail with questions and stuff. Chris and I have been partnered for 40 years, and I'm not saying we can complete each other's sentences, but I can usually figure out what he's going to be talking about. And eats numbers like junk food, and is not intimidated by formulas or stuff like that. Eric, let me put it this way. You know Urich, the book, Principles of Sonar?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. He totally understands that book. Boy, really? I could have used a few pictures there because it's all graphs and equations. And right. It's underwater acoustics is so weird anyways. But I know a guy smarter than that. Sid Meier, the guy who designed Civilization.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. They did, Microprose came to us and wanted to do a game, Hunt for Red October. And they were one of several people that bid on it. And we went with them. And they wrote a fun game that actually had some LOFAR analysis and other things in it that you had to do to properly identify the target. And it was from the point of view of the submarine. And of course, Sid wanted to learn all about sonar. And Chris sent him a copy of Urich. Now, this book is amazingly detailed and filled with more math than I could ever hope to understand. Sid not only read it, but he called me up one day after he read it and said, Larry, if I'm understanding Urich properly, if you send a sonar beam really, really deep, you can it goes a long way horizontally and through this and he had deduced the deep sound channel from reading Urich, which was written before the deep sound channel was discovered. Huh. And I just, I'm in the presence of genius. There's no other way to describe it. Sid is that smart. So if you're out there, Sid, and you hear this, hats off to you, buddy.
Yeah, I hope so. That means he's listening to our show. That'd be awesome.
So yeah, sonars. I'm always fascinated by sonar. We had a guy goes by the name of Jive Turkey. He was a sonar tech.
Yeah.
On and got to kind of pick his brain about that, talk as much as he could. Obviously, a lot of that stuff's classified, but it always fascinates me. The broadband and the narrow band and how you can track these things. And it's just incredible. You can find out what kind of ship it is by the blade count, and then different
frequencies
it makes from the different systems on board. It's just fascinating.
Absolutely. we put as much of that as we could into our books, uh, without trying to get into too much technobabble. Uh, I mean, there's one in Shattered Trident where we're talking about whether you're looking at a new construction sub or one that's been around for a while by how messy the frequencies are, whether they're blurry or sharp. Uh, lots of ways that you can use sonar to get a lot of useful information, and it's such a vital part of what you do for submarining that we couldn't get away from it, and that's fine. I mean, I have a Catholic nun, God bless her, who is one of my biggest fans, Sister Clarice. If you look through our books, there's always a mention of Sister Clarice from Minnesota, who is Jerry Mitchell's sister in the book, and that's just me saying hi to her. And
That's cool.
she's a dear, sweet woman who was the principal of a Catholic Catholic grade school, and was the farthest thing you can imagine from a ruler slapping tyrant, I guess is the way that they're often portrayed. But she says her letters to me always talk about how much she's learned about submarine warfare. She never expected to.
That's awesome.
It's pretty
I don't think Sister Clarice is going to be listening to this interview anyway. But if you're out there, God bless you. Thank you so much.
There you go. Yeah. So we were talking about Jive. He was actually excited about the show. He's actually listening, I think, and he wanted me to ask you how long you worked with Captain Christopher Carlson to design Harpoon.
Well, I designed the first edition. I wrote on my own when I was still aboard USS McKean, and that was in '79. It was published in April of '80, just as I was coming to Center for Naval Analyses. Now I still have the first letter that Chris wrote me later that year, basically almost as soon as he bought it. And Chris and I maintained a lively conversation through '80 and '82. Now '82 is after the Falklands War. I realized that there were some serious holes in Harpoon, and updated the game and released it as a second edition. Chris contributed quite a bit to that, but he didn't get his name on the book, on the rules, until the fourth edition. I think the third edition was from Game Designers Workshop, and that one was '87, and that was, the first two were published by an outfit called Adventure Games, and they were headed by Dave Arneson, the publisher, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons, along with Gary Gygax.
Oh wow!
And Dave was a good friend of mine, and I, an amazing guy. And I grew up in Minnesota. I mean, there's not a lot to do in the winter at nights in Minnesota, so we play war games. And I was playing Dungeons and Dragons before it was published, And I went over I was at Dave's house. We were playing this game. Back then it was called Chainmail. And there was a Chainmail annex. Okay, let me back up. Chainmail was a game about castles and catapults and knights and all this other stuff. I mean, it was just medieval warfare, a war game. And then somebody wrote an annex for it, a supplement, that added magic and dragons and stuff like that, because they read Tolkien and said, well, this is just a medieval technology, so we should just be able to fold this right into this medieval war game. And it was hugely successful. I played a couple of games that way. And so I'm over at Dave's place, and we're playing this game, and we're fighting orcs. And I'm going, what's an orc? Because I hadn't read Tolkien. And so I didn't know what he was talking about. So he said, roll the dice. And so we rolled. It was the Temple of the Frog, which was the first supplement that Dave ever did. Dave was a good friend. We didn't get to hang out together as much as we used to. I mean, after I left Minnesota to join the Navy, Dave used to run war games all the time at the Source and elsewhere. Just a wonderful guy. He came out one year for Origins when it was on the East Coast and stayed with me at my house. And then we drove up to Origins together. On the way, we stopped at a bookstore called Second Story Books in Minneapolis. No, I'm sorry. No, my bad. Second Story Books is in Baltimore. It was on the way because they had some stuff I was going to look at, some naval papers that they told me about. So when they found out that the guy who was just browsing the stacks while I was upstairs was Dave Arneson, they almost mobbed him and had him sit down with them and explain in detail all the different editions of Dungeons and Dragons. Because Dave knew how many had been in the first print run, what the cover looked like, how many were in the following print runs, how the cover was changed. No one had ever collected that information before. And these guys are all about bibliographies and knowing rare books and what they look like. If you got a copy of White Box Dungeons and Dragons now, the original three books, that's a couple $100, probably. I've got an autographed copy, of course. But the thing is, they were like, "Oh my God, this is Dave Arneson," and they actually gave me a deal on some of this stuff because I had brought Dave Arneson in, and we ran an obit on him when he passed away several years ago. He was teaching game design down at Full Sail University until just shortly before he passed away. But yeah, so Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, anyways, Dungeons and Dave Arneson published the first two editions from his company, but they folded. I went with Game Designers Workshop for the third edition. Then for the fourth edition, we went to Clash of Arms, and we're with them for a while, published a lot of stuff, and now we're our own company, the Admiralty Trilogy Group. Sort of a side trip there, but I hope it was worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you generally have to work with other developers like that, right?
Yeah. Did I answer this question? Is that so? Chris has been intimately involved since '96, and was very much involved before that.
And then, well, I guess that can segue us. Oh, I can't speak. Segue us into Harpoon. Now, Harpoon's interesting. It's actually kind of two different games, right? You have the video game on the computer, and you have a board game, which is turn-based, right?
Yeah. And the video game. Well, the video game is okay. Technically, it's not a video game in that it's not a console, and it's not real time. It is a war game, a simulation, to be precise. Okay. And the version that is out there is based mostly on the third edition. I guess it's still in circulation. Some people are still playing it, and I'm glad they are. I'm glad they're enjoying it. The rules are always at the heart of the game, and they changed a lot of stuff to make it work on the computer. So it's not really any linked to any particular edition right now. I don't know if they're updating the data or the scenarios, but it was very successful. The rules are, the 5th edition is going to be out from us literally any day now. We've been the 4th edition. The last version of it was published in 2001. That was version 4.1. 1996 was 4. 2001 was 2001. And we looked for ways to improve it. I mean, there's so much going on. We were learning about new sensors. It's also about us getting smarter about naval warfare and smarter about how to model that in paper rules so that people could play it manually. I mean, we don't have we can't depend on the computer. We have to come up with ways for people to do all this stuff on the tabletop. And that was seriously hard. We tried a couple things after 2001. We would say, well, let's try modeling air defense this way. And we take it to the convention, and people would give it a big thumbs down. Okay, back to the drawing board. And we were also developing other games. Harpoon was the first naval war game that I developed. But at Clash of Arms and then Admiralty Trilogy Group, we've expanded that now. So we have World War II, Command at Sea, World War I, Fear God Dreadnought, and then Dawn of the Battleship, which is what they call the pre-Dreadnought era, from 1895 to 1905 Russo-Japanese War. So we were doing a lot of stuff and getting smarter about naval warfare. And I think we probably had to get those smarts before we could go back to Harpoon and rewrite the game and update it, not only in terms of weapons and systems and data, but in terms of how we play and model all this complex stuff that's going on. So, yeah, I mean, it's we started out by ruthlessly. I mean, the game was at about 128 pages in the 4th edition, and we immediately cut it down to I don't know, maybe 100 pages. Yay us! We made it shorter. We made it simpler. Then we started adding stuff back in: ballistic missiles, UAVs and USVs, combat systems was something that I totally ignored for years. And it turns out, if you're covering a naval period from 1955 up to the current day, you've really got to pay attention to combat systems, because my World War II era destroyer that I served on was a little bit slower on seeing a target and reacting to it than a Burke-class destroyer. If you don't show that difference, then you're doing a disservice to the player. You need to show that accurately. So we now have combat system delay. And oh, by the way, in earlier versions of Harpoon, it used to be that if you could see something, if you detected something, missiles away, weapons free. Ain't that easy? Even with an active radar contact, you have to develop a fire control solution. This is something submariners live with all the time, of course, because the stuff that they get off of sonar is fuzzy and contradictory, and it takes them a while to sort it out. But you would think radar is very straightforward. No, we have, we managed to get up to the Naval War College. Their archives include a lot of stuff from the 70s and 60s that has been declassified. And it talks about exercise reports, it talks about weapons characteristics. I mean, and this is stuff that was secret when I was still in the fleet. No, it's all declassified now. And we got to see how some of the stuff actually performs. And guess what? Just because it comes in a range doesn't mean you automatically detect it on radar.
Right.
Just because you could, and even if you see it, you still have to go through a series of steps before you can actually launch. And if you do, so now what we have is what's called a weapons placement roll. And this is something the players are going to have to get used to, is that you generate a fire control solution. It could be really good, it could be fair, it could be poor. Well, if it's a poor fire control solution, your weapon placement roll is like 20%, 30% chance of that being a proper solution. If it's a good solution, then you're up to like 80%. But you miss your weapon placement roll, and that salvo you fire just goes clear off in the middle of next week. You just have a nice day, and that's it, guys. You just shot your salvo on what you a wing and a prayer, and God did not hear you. Sorry. So that kind of stuff. I mean, it was us learning that was important and that it mattered for the game, and then figuring out ways to do that. So we're back up to like 138 pages now.
I can imagine that can get extremely complex.
Seriously.
Yeah. I've never played the board game myself. I've only had the game on the computer, so I'm not too aware of that. But I can imagine, the computer will do everything for you. But
well, that is the advantage of the computer, and we would love for somebody to come up and say, "Hey, we'd like to automate the 5th edition." These days, it's a little bit more expensive than it was back in the days when it was a 386 or a 486 chip. I mean, we are going to have so much in there that you learn this, and you're going to really learn about naval warfare.
Oh yeah,
in a way that is impossible. I mean, it is possible to really learn and understand naval warfare almost as much as a professional does. just by going through unclassified sources and stuff. I will. One of my favorite authors, naval authors, is a guy named Norman Friedman. Dr. Norman Friedman has written over 30 books on naval warfare. And I picked up on one early in my career when I was still in the fleet called Naval Radar. I said, "Gee, I'm the radar officer. I should probably read this book." and there was stuff in there they didn't cover in radar school, and I went, "Holy crap, this is useful!" And there are other examples. You can go back. Another guy I like to talk about is Hector C. Bywater. Either of you guys ever heard of him?
Have you?
No,
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, you need to hear about him. Hector C. Bywater was a naval enthusiast, not unlike me. In fact, although he didn't even have any naval service to his credit, he was simply very interested in the Navy and studied and read and learned and became so knowledgeable on naval affairs that he ended up being a spy for the Royal Navy during World War I in Germany. He would visit the German shipyards and take notes on the ships that were being built, and then send that information to the Royal Navy. He contributed a lot of material to a popular ship reference called Jane's Naval. Jane's Fighting.
Jane's Fighting Ships. Yeah.
Go back to the 30s and well, through the 30s, but I think certainly back in the 20s. If you look at the photo credits on a lot of the stuff, you see H.C. Bywater. Now, he wrote a great book. It was a techno thriller. He wrote it in 1929. It was called The Great Pacific War of 1933. And it's the U.S. versus Japan in 1933. And it's a heck of a read. It's an exciting story. And the reason he wrote it was he wanted to comment on naval affairs, but the British Official Secrets Act wouldn't let him write about the Royal Navy. So he wrote about the U.S. Navy and Japan. He wrote other books as well about naval affairs, but that's the one that's really to his claim to fame.
It's fascinating.
Yeah,
and then 10 years later.
Years before Red Storm Rising.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, Jane's, they don't necessarily tell you about authorship. They just kind of they put out these great books, but I haven't
it's great books that none of us can afford.
Yeah, I haven't looked at one in a long time. So I don't have $1,200.
I listen. As much as I need the data and use the data, I don't buy Jane's new. I'm sorry.
You have a few years old. Yeah, I have a few. I paid $1,500 for, from 10 years ago, 5 years ago.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, okay, I will plug another one of my books.
Yeah.
Our books. Okay, this is the War Game Vault through the Admiralty Trilogy Group publishes Modern Chinese Maritime Forces. Now, everybody knows, the guys who are interested in the navies of today know that the Chinese are building ships at a tremendous rate.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they would. I will pardon the pun. A sea change about 20 years ago. I think they were shocked by what they saw in Desert Storm and Bosnia and places like that, where they've always depended on quantitative superiority over us or wherever they were going to fight. And in those conflicts, especially Bosnia, we showed that technology is its own quantity. And we were running rings around the Iraqis. We suffered no casualties in Bosnia because we were so much better than the other side. We could leverage all that technology to really create a tactical advantage. And they said, okay, we can't get by with just numbers anymore. And so they started to build more modern stuff and put more money. The government put more money into the armed forces. And so that's the background. There huge buildup over the past 20 years. And there was a guy named Manfred Meyer who wanted to publish a book about the Chinese Navy just recently, a few years ago. And Manfred couldn't find a publisher until we heard about it. And we said, well, of course we'll publish it. And so Manfred has submitted over 500 drawings for all these different Chinese ships. And it's not just the Chinese Navy, it's the Chinese maritime militia, it's the Chinese
right.
Guard.
We talked about that last week.
Chinese, Maritime Safety Agency. It's the Hong Kong Auxiliary. I mean, there must be a dozen paramilitary organizations, and if you know from watching the accounts, that's the stuff that's always out there mixing it up, creating trouble, pushing other guys.
Philippines and Vietnam.
Yeah, you can't account for them. You don't know who's what.
He's got all that stuff in his book, and we went, well, of course we'll publish that. And because we're electronic, we got it out. I mean, he gave me the draft in the summer of 2010. No, why am I saying 2010? It's 2020 now. I think it was 2018 he gave me the draft in the summer. And we had it out by that fall. And the beauty of it is it's electronic. It's a living document. Because much to our surprise, Manfred kept sending us stuff even after the book was published.
Yeah.
Cool. So we dropped the new stuff in, commissionings, decommissionings, better drawings of preliminary classes or entire, paramilitary organizations added. And we've been updating that thing every quarter. So you're looking at this document that is no more than 3 months out of date. And by the way, the illustrations are amazing. And yes, this is a plug for what I think is a very underrated book. We've gotten very good reviews from pros about it. The Navy won't tell us whether they're using it officially or not. ONI, they've got their, well, we won't tell you whether it matches the satellite photos or not. But I mean, well, heck, these days, Chris, being the naval engineer that he is, he uses Google Earth to zoom in, look at the ships on the ways, look at their length, look at their beam, and figure out possible displacement stuff. So some of the stuff that was technical intelligence 30 years ago is open to everybody these days.
Oh yeah, that's the incredible thing. Yeah, you think back in the 80s, or like you talk about it in Red Storm Rising, and other stuff too.
Oh yeah.
Like we have today, what we have access to for free, completely for free on Google Maps or Google Earth, is in some cases a lot better than what even the U.S. government had back in the 80s.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the only thing is, I think the government probably. I mean, you look at the Google Earth and it will always tell you when the photo was taken. I think our U.S. government can get more recent photos than that. Right. But I mean, for a writer, Google Earth is a tremendous resource, because when I'm writing a scene set in a certain location, you don't want to bet I'm zooming in on that scene and looking at the way it's laid out,
the terrain and everything.
First rule of writing fiction is it's a lot easier to describe what is than make it up and then keep it straight. I mean, the ability. Okay, when we wrote Exit Plan, which was I think the third Jerry Mitchell book, a lot of it's set along the southern coast of Iran. Well, I was looking. I spent a lot. I almost feel like I should have gotten a tourist visa, because I was there, zooming into max detail. And when you see them, them talking about, well, there's a draw here or a hill there. There is a hill there, okay? Unless the Iranians have moved it since they took that photo. and as a writer, I really felt good about that, because it's so much easier to describe a scene, and then of course there's the action that the characters and the actors are doing, but making stuff up is hard. Plus, sometimes you get fodder. Oh my gosh, look at this! There's a spot where they'll be vulnerable here if they're going to get shot at if they go this way. Well, what are they going to do over here instead? Can they go over here instead? So you're problem solving along with the characters, and it's almost role playing, almost, but it's a lot more fun, and I think really gets the creative juices flowing.
It does. Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you know if talking about that makes me think of again Red Storm Rising, when they're talking about these Marines trekking across Iceland after they left Keflavik. or the Soviet tanks rolling through Germany. I mean, he goes into great detail describing different hills and bridges and all that. Do you know if Clancy visited any of these areas in Germany there or up in Iceland to actually get into that level of detail? Or was it just maps and things he was looking at?
It was maps. That was one of my first lessons from Tom regarding researching. Tom literally wrote a letter to the Icelandic ambassador in Washington, D.C., saying, "Dear son, we're going to write a novel where your country is going to be invaded. Could we get some maps and other information about the country?" And I went, "Tom, are you nuts? What is he?" And I went, "Oh my God." And they sent him back this huge package. There were tourist guides, even a video. There was even a tourist video showing the landscape. I'm going, oh my God. Larry learns an important lesson about research. Don't be afraid to ask just because you're afraid you're going to piss somebody off. And so it was maps and stuff like that. And I actually was approached by somebody I was talking to a short while ago, said, we use the best topographical maps we could find of Germany. And here's another trick to writing. Okay, if you can only find wherever you can find the best maps, that's where you set the action. Don't pick a place and then find the map. Find the map, then pick the place. Always write around what you don't know. We actually had somebody suggest that it would be fun to go do a staff ride around Germany to follow the action in the Red Storm Rising. And that was before COVID, of course. So we'll see what happens there. I'll tell you another story about research with Red Storm Rising. Okay, we were working on obviously one of the things we wanted to do was show a lot of the high level meetings. What is the Politburo doing during the war? I mean, we knew we were going to have some climactic scenes there where the Politburo is arguing about what they should do. And this is in the 80s when the Politburo is still very much a mysterious, we don't know what goes on, we don't know anything about it. And there was a very good book that came out shortly before Tom and I started work called Breaking with Moscow. It was a story of Arkady Shevchenko, who was I think he was the highest level official to ever defect from the Soviet Union. He was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations. And it's the story of his life in Russia and why he chose to defect and everything else. And Tom, utilizing our newly acquired literary agent, reached out to Shevchenko's agent and said, "We'd like to set up a meet. We want to ask him some questions. Is that okay?" Shevchenko said yes. So the next thing I know, Tom and I are going to some Washington, D.C. party in Vienna, I might add, where very nice place. And lo and behold, here's Arkady Shevchenko. And I'm like, my God, this guy is like, he should be a historical institution. The guy's worked with Gromyko, with Khrushchev, with all the heavies. I mean, this guy could write an amazing book. He wrote one about himself. He never wrote anything else, I'm sorry to say. Shevchenko was a classic dour Russian. And we're sitting down at the party, nibbling on hors d'oeuvres, and yes, I had a refreshing beverage. And we're talking. And I'm watching Tom work. My questions were all about the process. What are do they have an agenda? Are they allowed to bring up topics? I mean, is this like a formal meeting, or is it a bunch of guys in the room arguing? Tom's questions were all about what kind of room do they meet in? Is it one of the fancy ornate czarist rooms in the Kremlin, or do they have some sort of ultra modern bunker somewhere that they meet in? What's the security? I mean, Tom's questions were all about verisimilitude, and I really took that away from that interview. That was important to me, is the information we learned and put into the book is the kind of stuff that matters and makes that scene real for the reader.
Yeah.
And it's trivial stuff. Why would you care about what kind of room they were in? Well, it sets the atmosphere. It allows the reader to hook the visual part of his imagination to something, and build the scene up in his mind. So, you know, that's reason. Of course, we went out and we talked to a bunch of people. We went down to Langley Air Force Base. We went to Aberdeen. Tom got to climb in an M1 and fire the main gun. That was serious.
Nice.
Yeah, he used the shell casing as an ashtray for years until he quit smoking. He said it was great because you only had to empty it once a month.
We're getting a little bit of feedback again now. Let's see if that's any better. Yeah. Okay, we're good. Now I lost my train of thought. You have anything to jump in with?
No, not necessarily. I think we pretty much covered everything that we were gonna. I don't know what your thought was gonna be, but
what was I gonna say? I was gonna say something about Red Storm Rising.
I have the book if you want to read it real quick.
Yeah, I'll read
it's
the
only
whole
600 pages.
What, you didn't read the book? You got to read the book.
No, it's
Yeah,
trying to
Eric
jog
didn't
his
fit-
memory.
So, what about so the basic plot? I know a lot of people have kind of criticized the background plot or the start to it. So I don't think I'm spoiling anything. I think a lot of people who are listening have read it. If not, this is only the very intro. So the basic premise is that now I know you don't have to defend this. It's not necessarily your book. It's Clancy's book, but so an oil facility in the Soviet Union was attacked, right? And they're running low on oil. It's going to have some pretty bad consequences for them. So they decide to invade the Middle East. But they know if they invade the Middle East, the U.S. is going to come and fight them. So they have to take out NATO. It seems like easier said than done. We have to take out NATO.
Yeah.
Just get rid of NATO, then we can go in the Middle East.
Bring several lunches because you are going to be at that for a while. Okay, our research, I think I've already talked about how the Russians really have a very defensive mindset. And Tom and I were both convinced that given that the Russian army hasn't really been in combat much before Afghanistan. We were writing this before Afghanistan, I think. Let me think. No, Afghanistan happened, and the Russian army wasn't doing
79 to 89.
Yeah, so Afghanistan happened, but they weren't doing particularly well. And our sense was that they would not, and this is just being a responsible leader as well, that they would not go to war unless they felt there was no other alternative, that they were pushed into a corner where they simply felt it was existential survival. And now people can define existential survival in a lot of ways, and obviously for the Russian, it would include, political survival. So beyond the scenario of the oil pipeline terrorism, oil shortage thing, we really wanted to convey the idea that it was not going to be some bolt from the blue attack with absolutely no warning, which was sort of what I grew up with in the 50s and 60s. The Russians could attack at any time. The Russians, bolt from the blue. And, we did not have a bomb shelter in my backyard, but I remember doing I was doing the drills under the desks.
Duck and cover?
Yeah, we did the duck and cover stuff. Of course, when you're that age, you don't really think about it very much. But, world ending, I could handle that. I can understand that at that age and was not real thrilled with the idea. But anyways, all we really wanted to do was set up a premise and show the Russian logic that they felt their criteria was such that they felt that they had to go against NATO. They weren't looking forward to it. They did not. We probably could have done more in terms of saying, hey, we're not sure we're going to win, but we're going to do this anyway. And that's been a constant theme through all my books, that it's the last alternative, not the first alternative. Beyond that, there are still some things that I would like to update, but on the whole, I think it still flows fairly well in terms of the course of the war and the outcome. In that, Tom and I spent I don't know how many hours talking about the whole nuclear issue, how you have two nuclear powers go to war and not go nuke.
That's always fascinating. I've thought about that a lot.
NATO had said that we reserve the right to use nukes, and Russia had tons of them, and didn't. And the Russians have always been less choosy about what constitutes a tactical nuke versus a strategic nuke. They don't really see a sharp dividing line like the West does. I guess tactical also depends on where it hits. If it's over there, it's tactical. If it's over here, it's strategic. So if there was going to be nuclear escalation, how do we? And so what we had to do is do basically a mini coup at the end of the book, which is believable based on history and other things that have happened elsewhere. For instance, the almost coup that happened in Japan, because the military wanted to continue the war even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, we had a lot of fun writing the coup thing. That was, getting into that political intrigue. I think that was something that really appealed to Tom. To show the nukes without lighting the entire book on fire was difficult, because you have to come up with a series of circumstances where the smart people win, and they don't use the nukes. Yeah. I mean, we could have just easily had you turn to the last page and says, "Okay, set the book on fire, world ends." That's not a rewarding ending, and it would probably have affected sales adversely.
It's smart, and I thought the intro of it, I didn't think it was too necessarily unbelievable. I know some people are more critical than others, but it kind of harkens back to like you were talking about with Japan, right? To some extent, Japan got into a war over oil. Not completely. Yeah. There's a lot more to it than that, but that was an element of it.
Oil and other resources. I mean, they've always been resource poor, and I don't think we understood here in the U.S. what the effect was of cutting off the scrap metal shipments and the other things that we did prior to World War II. Although I think we understood their effect, we did not understand what effect those economic effects would have on the Japanese leadership. So it's getting, again, how do you predict the mind of your adversary or your potential adversary?
Yeah,
that's why. I mean, I'm not saying the Pacific War was a mistake. I'm not saying we could have not stopped those shipments and that everything would have been fine after that. The Japanese were already involved in a very aggressive war in China, and I don't think it was possible for the U.S. to not become involved in that conflict eventually, because eventually the Japanese would have done something where we're going, okay, stop the problem, and we would have gone to war then. But that's just my thoughts on that.
It's interesting, because then you think about sanctions and things today on North Korea, on Iran, Russia, and all that, and you think, okay, let's starve the nation, or let's have a punishment, some sort of negative thing happen to them, so they have to pay for what they're doing that the U.S. doesn't like, whether it's building nuclear weapons or this, that, or whatever. And then, but you really have to get into the psychology of the leadership then, right? How are they going to react to that? If it really gets really bad, in some of these cases, their people don't suffer. The people end up suffering, not them.
Well, the people are going to suffer. Any type of conflict, usually, it's almost like, okay, there's this thing in physics where any form of energy devolves into heat eventually. It degrades to that. Any form of conflict eventually results in an adverse effect for the population. Okay, it's just the way it works. Sanctions, war, economic boycotts, all that stuff. It's the leadership are going to be the least affected, except in terms of their thinking, and especially with a non-democratic state where they're not really deeply concerned about the mood of the citizen in the street, it can be very hard to affect them. I mean, Red Phoenix showed North Korea, I think, fairly accurately at that time. The follow-on book, Red Phoenix Burning, showed current North Korea. We should really call that one Red Phoenix: The Next Generation. I'm sorry, but that was taken, so we just called it Red Phoenix Burning. But again, it's about what do you do with a country that's being basically run as a mafia crime family. It's a criminal enterprise, and I'm not the one coming up with that term. It's I see in a lot of U.S. policy papers because they're engaged in counterfeiting, drug manufacturing, arms exports to God knows who, all kinds, anything to generate foreign exchange, because there are so many sanctions in place. So the sanctions are having an effect, but it's not changing their behavior.
Yeah, and even if it did, though, like going back to Japan, or even with the Red Storm Rising to an extent, you place sanctions on and you do things like that, you might have the intent of hurting them enough so they change course, but they could change course the other way and end up starting a war.
Absolutely, especially with North Korea in possession of nukes now. On the other hand, for them to use the nukes, it would be equivalent to national suicide, which in Kim's case is very personal. He knows it would be the end of his regime. On the other hand, he might be willing to take the rest of the area down if he felt that's what was going to happen. That's what we showed to a certain extent in Red Storm and Red Phoenix Burning, was the collapse of North Korea from a failed coup and things happening, and frankly, that's the more probable scenario these days, as opposed to Kim Il Sung back in the 80s.
So what do you think about Iran and nuclear weapons? That's obviously been a big one, especially now with the ending of the JCPOA.
Well, it's okay. We wrote Persian Incursion in 2010, which was a game all about the Iranian nuclear program and the Israelis trying to bomb it out of existence, which they've been threatening to do for decades. And there are a couple of intangibles. One, pure bombing only campaigns don't have a big success rate. On the other hand, it's the Israelis, and they have a very limited target set. They bomb these facilities, they can keep the Iranians from building a bomb if you don't have any centrifuges, if you don't have any uranium extraction plants, et cetera, you can prevent them from building one. On the other hand, the Iranians can just rebuild.
Right. You can set them back a year or two, but
yeah, it's what the criteria we had in the game. Okay, the game was not designed to say the Israelis should or should not.
Fair enough,
it was just an exploration of what was possible. Could the Israelis actually do it? And could the Iranians? It's not enough for the Israelis to just bomb the Natanz nuclear extraction plant. It's not enough for them to bomb Kosar or any of the other facilities. They have to bomb them and show the Iranians that they can come back and do it any time they want to. In other words, win so big that the Iranians say there's no future in this, and they just give it up because they know it's going to be a waste of money. And that's what it really comes down to. The Iranians have poured tremendous amounts of money into building and hiding a nuclear weapons program.
Oh yeah,
now,
they're all a lot of them are underground too, right? Natanz and even places at Bushehr and Fordo.
Well, okay, let's talk about a couple of them in detail. Natanz is the one that everybody talks about because so much of it is underground. But Natanz is still vulnerable to some of the men, like the GBU-28.
Oh yeah.
If you double tap, you can get through with the GBU-28, and the Israelis have them. Fordo is much harder to get to. Bushehr is a non-starter. That's not an issue It's the wrong kind of reactor, and it's actually their sort of hood ornament, this peaceful reactor, where it is really just for peaceful nuclear power. But I think a lot of the guys that are trained at Boucher and trained throughout elsewhere go into the system. Now, there are periods where I think they're working on it hard, and then there are periods when they're not working on it hard. I think right now they're sort of trying to decide, do they want to get back into the business or not? It is a tremendous economic strain for them. So much technical talent, so much resources in terms of getting around sanctions that are in place to build this stuff. I mean, when we were researching this in we started working on it, I think in about 06 and finally came out with a game in 010. There were so many examples of the Iranians going through amazing lengths to get stuff around sanctions into the country and trying to fool but there are a lot of places in the nuclear weapons production cycle, installations that the Iranians have that are not hardened. Natanz and Fordo are the only ones that are really, really hardened. And I think that they hardened Fordo even more than Natanz because they figured out that a 2.5 meter slab with rock and another 2.5 meter slab was not enough. So they're now putting it even deeper underground at Fordo. And whether the Natanz plant will ever do industrial grade uranium separation up to bomb grade level, I don't know if that'll ever happen there. But what we did with our game was have the player pick one of several strategies. He could either directly bomb the installations to try and simply remove the capability, or he could bomb economic targets. What if he started bombing? What if the Israelis started bombing all the oil refining installations, oil storage, things like that, putting tremendous economic pressure on Iran. The only foreign exchange they get is from oil. The only way they get any money. And by the way, the Iranian populace is amazingly sensitive to the price of gas. It is kept artificially low by the government to keep the local populace happy. Mm-hmm. I know before I said that authoritarian governments really don't care about the man in the street, but you start jacking up the price of gas, and the Iranian man in the street is going to start pulling out torches and pitchforks. They get really upset, and so the Israeli player has different strategies he can play, and then the Iranian player has strategies he can play as well, terrorist attacks and other things he can do to try and go on foot the Israeli offensive. And meanwhile, and this is the fun part, in addition to Iran and Israel duking it out, not that Iran can do that much, their best card is to play the victim. There are opinion tracks for the U.S., the UN, China, Russia. All the players have their own independent track, and the military actions. This is the critical part of the game. The military actions are turned into political points, which the two players can use to influence the other major players. For instance, if Iran manages to put enough political points into China, maybe China is going to give them some advanced fighters to defend against the Israelis. Maybe if the U.S. if Israel gets enough political points into the U.S. comes into the war. And there are cards involved where you play cards, and you can have opportunities, for instance, for cyber attacks or sabotage. You can also play misfire, where maybe the Iranian terrorists try and blow up something, and it turns out to be the wrong country. And oops, all of a sudden their opinion track goes into the toilet, and they've got another enemy. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's a political military simulation, which is based on Harpoon, but goes way beyond that in terms of
the political stuff.
The political stuff.
Interesting.
And that whole converting the military and the political action. We see that all the time. That's how terrorists make their effective. I mean, I'm sorry, killing a couple of U.S. soldiers in Iran or in Iraq or Afghanistan is not about affecting the military outcome. It's about getting political points that they can use to advance their own cause.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And so one of the things I also sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'll final summation. If the Iranians thought they could get away with building a bomb, they would, because they want to be the leader of the Islamic world. They want to be the head top guy, and if they have the bomb, they can claim that role. I'm sorry. That's all.
It seems. I mean, if I was Iran, I would build one right away. I mean, try to build it as secretly as you can. Obviously, try not to get attacked, before you're done. But you have to look at places like North Korea. They built a nuclear bomb, and now they're pretty much insulated from ever being invaded.
Well, that's true. I mean, we would have to think twice about going into an attack against North Korea. On the other hand, they have a very limited number of weapons and delivery systems, and you can bet those would be at the top of the list. Also, and this is just my personal opinion, we sort of came up with this when Chris and I were working on Red Phoenix Burning. They're going to be very close, either physically or through communications chains, to Kim, because he's going to maintain real tight control over those weapons. He certainly doesn't want anybody else able to launch anything, because he's always thinking about coups. He's always thinking about other people.
I can imagine. He must live in fear all the time of everyone around him.
Well, imagine imagine something like it's like the court of Louis XIV or something, but without, with no frills and bad food, and they just, I mean, we know we found out there are factions. It's pretty well known now that there are factions within the North Korean government, but it's just sycophants and supporters, and toadies currying favor, and Kim doesn't like it, you're toast. So I really think that I'm not saying the possibility of a coup is 100%, but that's one of the ways the government could really go down. If it collapses from a coup or some sort of internal power structure, that can get ugly real fast, because then now who's got the nukes?
Exactly.
Who's got the chemical weapons, and there may be even biological weapons up there. I wouldn't put it past them. And all that stuff is now up for grabs. Well, assume crash positions.
Yeah. Do you think not necessarily saying you think it's right or wrong or anything, not taking a side, but do you think you could see the U.S., if there was a coup, the U.S. then trying to go into North Korea and trying to secure these weapons as quickly as possible?
Oh, there's no question in my mind that would be number one on everybody's parade. I won't give too much away in the book, but what obviously that scenario that I've discussed has been talked about. People in the business have told me that the scenario we have in Red Phoenix Burning is exactly one they are looking at, because they want to have things in place. There are two main issues you've got to deal with. One is the nukes. Where are they? Who's got them? And let's get them away from there as fast as possible. Two is the humanitarian crisis, which would be just as great, and maybe even a bigger threat. The North Korean populace doesn't really have a independent food distribution system. They've got a lot of little closet, semi-covert markets where they sell a lot of local produce. But most food distribution is handled through the government. I mean, you get rations from the government. And if the government control breaks down, who's passing out all that food?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden you're talking mass starvation. I mean, even worse than what they call there's a term they have for the famine that they experienced about 10, 15 years ago. where it was literally so bad there were bodies lying in the street. And sometimes you think it's propaganda, but when you get eyewitnesses that are talking about things that they've seen, you tend to give it a little bit more credence and credence. Things are pretty bad over there, and I'm not sure that they're all that great now. There's no public health system. You don't want to think that COVID is doing a number on the North Korean population right now. I don't know. It's not a good situation, and so the South Koreans, who are, as far as the South is concerned, the North's cousins, neighbors, and friends, would do their level best to get up into there quickly and try and either secure the country, save the people. I mean, it's getting a little old now. I mean, the Korean War was in the 50s, and it was 1950 through 52, 50, whatever. But there are still people alive who have relatives in the North. Mm-hmm. And family matters to Koreans a lot. So they don't see the North Koreans as the enemy. They see the North Korean population as being oppressed by this cruel regime. And if they thought that Kim was going down, or that he had gone down for some reason, or there's some sort of civil war going on, they'd be across the border even before we knew about it.
Interesting. I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
Well, and then you get into a situation where, okay, refugees streaming south in the thousands, okay, but wait, like I said, there's no public health system. Most of those North Koreans have never been vaccinated. Most of them don't, regular health care is something one of the reasons I know so much about the health thing is one of the characters we have in Red Phoenix Burning was we made a missionary. There is a Christian organization called Food and Friends, which has several missions in North Korea. Now, I don't know why the North Koreans let these guys operate there, except they're probably being paid off. And what they do is they grow vegetables and pass them out to the local population because it's a vital source of vitamins and nutrients for the locals. I mean, these guys, where else in the world would regular vegetables be medicine? Proper nutrition. I mean, do you remember that Korean defector that got across the border? He was a soldier.
Oh, yeah.
He's just a few
shot multiple times.
Ago.
Yeah.
Shot up multiple times. Well, when they got him into the hospital and they're patching him up, his body was riddled with parasites. Oh. Because of the poor health up there. And basically what it indicates is that basically they're using human manure as fertilizer. Huh. That's what they can get. So they're using manure as fertilizer. And that generates the growth of these parasites, and of course they've got no way to treat them. So I'm sure he feels a lot better now. They've given a couple of shots, like I don't know what, but getting those things out of his system, he probably feels like a new man. Not to mention the fact that he stands a better chance of living now. But so North Korea. So let's set it up. North Korea starts to implode. The South Koreans go north to help their relatives. These are relatives going north, and we're back. We've been backing up the South Koreans since 1950. You don't think we're going to go over there? Now, at first, it depends. We could go in and provide air defense and logistic support. We could put our ships along the coast to pick up refugee boats. There's a lot of things we can do that don't involve actually putting guys in North Korea. On the other hand, if the situation starts to get strange, we start sending in special operations forces. We start sending in ground troops to back up the South Koreans. Eventually, maybe the South Koreans roll things north, and we serve as garrisons or support troops in their rear, or maybe we're fighting side by side. I don't think most people would have problems with us going into North Korea if it was a failed state. And of course, now you've got China to the north. Maybe they're coming in too.
Yeah.
Because, there is an amazingly large North Korean expatriate population just across the border in China. And the Yellow River at places is shallow enough so you can just wade across. Now you stand a damn fine chance of getting shot when you do it, but if you do it when there's no guards around, you're in China. And so a active refugee community. There are smugglers smuggling stuff into North Korea. They at great risk. There are smugglers smuggling people out of North Korea at great cost. They make a lot of money. We read a fair amount about this. There was even a documentary made about the community of North Koreans on that side on the Chinese side of the Yalu.
I did. I watched the documentary. It was pretty interesting, and a lot of them would try to get up to Mongolia then, because then they can escape to wherever else from there.
Yeah, Mongolia or go south in one of the Southeast Asian nations. Of course, they don't have a lot of them don't have the resources, or they might save up and send one family member out, and then they try and bring everybody else out one at a time. It's the human stories are amazing. But China spends. I mean, I think their foreign aid budget, about 2/3 of their foreign aid budget, is aid for North Korea.
Wow.
In terms of food and fuel and everything else. Because North Korea spends most of its budget on the military. How do you think a country the size of North Korea has the 5th largest military in the world? Because they let the population eat rocks.
Yeah. Huh.
And so what does China do if North Korea implodes?
Right. They don't want a Western friendly, South Korea, the U.S., and everything right on their doorstep too, right up on their border necessarily. On top of all the humanitarian problems, they're going to have a mass wave of people coming into China.
Yeah. And the one thing China does not need, it's more people. So things can get messy up at that border, and that's all about what we talk about. All this that happens in the book. I mean, God knows, I'm sure I've made some dreadful inaccuracies in there about what life is like in North Korea right now, because I can only go on what I can find, and that's not very much. But we tried to show a country where basically saying the wrong thing can get you shot, saying that there's not a lot to eat, not a lot to look forward to, and where there's really this cult of personality which is completely devoted to preserving the man at the top in power. And if that guy goes away, the whole thing just falls apart. So that's what Red Phoenix Burning is about. I think it's a better book than Red Phoenix, because Red Phoenix was just North Korea invades us. They invade South Korea again. How do we react? What do we do about it? There's some battles, there's some heroes, and the good guy gets the girl in the end. That was my first one, strike it out on my own. I'm not ashamed of it. It did very well. I think it's a great story. But Red Phoenix Burning is much more current about what's going on right now.
Another scenario that's been fascinating me a lot recently is China and Taiwan. And kind of looking at it, going back, like I said, I read Red Storm Rising again. In some sense, it's almost like Iceland to the Soviet Union. That allowed them to get rid of the whole SOSUS network, the GIUK gap, and they can then get out into the Atlantic Ocean. And it's similar in a sense with Taiwan to China, right? They're kind of boxed in there with that first island chain with the Korean Peninsula, Japan, all the islands coming down, Okinawa, and then you have Taiwan and then the Philippines and all that. And so China's kind of boxed in there. And obviously Taiwan's been a big one.
Well, you're right. I mean, they talk about the first getting outside that first island chain all the time. And they're focusing on the South China Sea right now. I mean, a lot of people have been talking just lately, although it really is it comes in waves, of China actively, trying to take or conquer Taiwan. It's more likely now, I think, than it was in the 80s But I mean, back then the joke was about it would be a million-man swim because they didn't have the amphibious lift. They didn't have a lot of the other things you needed to stage a major amphibious operation. Now they do. But I think it's interesting that a lot of that amphibious lift is in the South. They've got 3 fleets, and the South Seas Fleet is the one where a lot of the good stuff is going. And I think a lot of the amphibious capabilities directed at the Spratlys, at the Paracels, the other southern island. And frankly, and this is just my personal opinion, China's always taken the long view with Taiwan. And they just figure eventually it's going to happen. Look what happened with Hong Kong. Finally, it is coming back to them. Not willingly, but conditions were such that the Chinese could leverage it so that they can get Hong Kong back under their control. It's not going to be. It's not, but so I think their second priority is the South China Sea. Taiwan, they're willing to let it sit because Taiwan would actively defend, and we would come to Taiwan's defense. I mean, if we saw, if we saw amphibious ships loading up and heading for Taiwan, we would say no, you don't,
right,
and actively oppose them. We have less. They're going to wait for a time when we're not as willing to do that, and that's when they may make a move. The moment I think Taiwan is reasonably secure, I'm sorry if I'm wrong. I'm really sorry if I'm wrong. But most of their effort these days seems to be in claiming any water in the South China Sea, right up to and sometimes including what's inside the 12-mile territorial limit of the littoral nations down there.
Yeah, with all the islands, they're just building islands out in the middle of the sea. It's incredible.
Yeah.
They're even doing one, I was not aware of it at first, but H.I. Sutton, when we had him on last week, he was talking about an island off the coast of India that China built out there. I was not even aware of that. But that's, they built an island out there.
Well, they've got a real concern about India and the Straits of Malacca. Mm-hmm. The problem with becoming a global power, which is what they've done, is all of a sudden you have global interests and global vulnerabilities. If China wants to cut off, let me start again. If India wanted to cut off trade with China, all they've got to do is park a bunch of ships at the Straits of Malacca, and that's it. Nothing else is getting through that way. And India has been building up its naval power since '72, and they're doing much better at it now than they were. And they're fully capable of doing that. And of course, India and China aren't on the best of terms lately.
No, definitely not. Especially everything's going on now.
Not that they're ready to go to war.
No.
But China, if China, even more than the Russians, obviously have to take the long view, and they look at that strategic vulnerability, and the geography isn't going to change. So I believe what they intend to do is develop enough of a presence in the Indian Ocean. So it's hard for India to block the straits. Not impossible, but if they can make it harder, then if India's presented with a decision, do we block the straits or do we not block the straits, maybe they come down on the no side, whereas before they would have said, yeah, sure, no problem. It's all about die modifiers and using wargaming terms.
Yeah.
You little influencers and working to reduce Indian desire to engage with China. People do not pay enough attention to the Indian-Chinese matchup. They are the two oldest civilizations on the planet. They're the two largest civilizations on the planet.
Yeah.
Both have nukes. Now, luckily, there's a heck of a mountain range in between the two of
The
them.
Himalayas, yeah.
And that makes it hard for them to fight. Thank goodness.
Because Western China is pretty sparsely populated, right? It's mostly all in Eastern. Yeah.
Yeah. To a certain extent, that if that land was flatter, of course, then the Chinese would be in there up to the border as well. They need the room, but that's worked to, I think, the world's advantage, in that China and India haven't had a lot to fight about. As China becomes, well, now that China is a global power, and as India has global interests as well, they may come into conflict. I mean, fighting over that patch of land they've got up in the Himalayas, I can't see a mechanism where that's going to blow up or expand into a nation state conflict. Do you?
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah.
Well, and India and China have been duking it out. Fisticuffs lately. It's there's always that. Oh man, I don't know. I don't think nukes are going to get pulled in, but they sure like to beat the crap out of each other on the border.
They do. They do.
Yeah, literally like fist fights.
Yeah.
Start throwing rocks and stuff. It's a strange thing. One last quote. We got to start wrapping up here soon, unfortunately. But one last thing I'd like to get your opinion on is the relationship between China and Russia.
Oh, that's
not a quick thing, is it?
Well, you got to do a history lesson first of all, because obviously China and Russia were joined at the hip
Right.
for so many years, and they had the falling out. What was it, 1956, 1960?
Yeah, the Sino-Soviet split.
Yeah, the Sino-Soviet split, and I'm failing with the time, but from that time until, I would say, almost the 80s, I really feel like China was this insular nation, and they knew they because they were engaged in their own type of, quote, democratic socialism, unquote. There were severe doctrinal differences. They didn't always get along. There was the Amur River dispute. There were other things going on where they were actually shooting at each other.
Yeah.
And which was fine with us, I guess.
Right.
You and him fight, but because of that, there's a certain tendency, I believe, for China to view itself as insular. For so long, they did not engage the outside world, and I think they fell back on that historical pattern. To a certain extent, that was why their armed forces, until recently, were very much concerned with defense. Why the Navy was very much a coastal defense force. They simply had other things to do with their money, like feed over 1 billion people, and try and build up their industry, and try and just do some of the other stuff that everybody else was finding very easy to do. But they had to do it for 1 million people, or 1 billion people. Excuse me. I think there are still parts of China that are still very, very poor and very non-industrialized. Maybe probably don't even have electricity. I mean, parts of them are still very much in the developing world. You have to acknowledge China as a modern industrial power, but there'll always be part of China that is far less developed and is working to catch up. The relationship with Russia, again, I think changed starting, I think, with Desert Storm and Bosnia and things like that, because they saw that they were vulnerable. I mean, we could really come in and do tremendous damage, and they would simply be helpless. We'd run rings around them. Their whole strategy was a people's war, and simply handing AK-47s to millions of reservists and throwing huge numbers of people at us. And they were confident that they could inflict enough casualties on us so that we would decide that this wasn't, whatever we were fighting about wasn't worth our time or that much blood, and go home. whereas they always have more Chinese. And we showed them that theory no longer held. I think their relations with Russia have improved, but they're not close buddies.
Yeah.
Russia is not. I'm sorry. Go.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, it's definitely been on again, off again, and then China buys a lot of their weapons, right? A lot of their weapons are based off of or just straight bought from Russia, but to me it really seems like they're gonna have a separation again. They're gonna have another issue in the future going forward, because they're copying and in some cases illegally. Taking the plans like for the the J-11B.
The J-11 is a straight copy of the Su-27K and is not it's
not licensed, right? The first one was.
Yeah, a lot of
stuff
is licensed built, but a lot of stuff is not. Yeah, Russia, I think, to China still represents a level of technology that they aspire to. There was a while back. I'm trying to remember the date they were commissioned. The Chinese bought 2 incomplete guided missile destroyers, Submarine class, from Russia. The Russians, after the collapse, they had a lot of ships that were still half completed. They didn't have the money to complete them because after the Soviet Union fell apart, the plugs just weren't there. And this is not unknown. Other nations have done this in other eras where you buy an incomplete hull and pay for them to finish it, and then they give it to you. The day those 2 guided missile destroyers showed up in China, they were the biggest and most powerful ships in the Chinese Navy. And the Chinese liked them so much, they bought 2 more new build. But while that was going on, the Chinese Navy built up to the point where those ships would no longer be considered top line. On the other hand, the Chinese still have a lot of holes in terms of electronics, aircraft engines. The Chinese, for some reason, cannot seem to manufacture decent jet engines for their aircraft. Their Wopan series jets, engines that they put in the J-11s, the mean time between failures is terrible. And so they put in Lyoka turbofans, AL-31s, I think. And they buy those from Russia. They buy SAMs from Russia. And you've now got this love-hate thing going where the Russians are willing to sell stuff, but only if the Chinese promise not to copy it or they put safeguards in place. I don't know how to describe what the current situation is. It's the Russians need the money, the Chinese need the gear, but that doesn't mean it's done out of love. I guess is the way I want to say it.
Right, and as China continues to expand, that eventually they might not. Once they have all the technology, they don't need it anymore.
Well, it's this kind of thing where back in the 80s, we used to say that the Chinese were building the newest obsolete ships in the world. But they would take 10 years to build a Luda class. And this is in the 70s, and it was something that the Russians were doing in the 50s, and we were already like 10 years ahead of that. So you could say Russians are 10 years behind us, and the Chinese were 20 years back. I would now say that it's more like the Russians are 5 years behind us, maybe, and the Chinese are about 10 years behind both of us. They have ships now which have something equivalent to Aegis.
Yeah.
There are holes in their armed forces, but they're going to continue to get what they can from Russia to build up their forces literally and their technology. They know they can't buy anything from us, so they'll steal what they can. That's the way they got the F-35.
Right, and their J-20 and a lot of that stuff is believed to be stolen from these different hacks where they got a lot of the self information.
To be they've got the helmet mounted sight just like the F-35.
Yeah,
and they had the same problems with it too. I don't know whether we came up with the same solution or not. The thing is, when you're playing tail chase with technology, you cannot simply go out and buy the new stuff and you're there. You have to learn how to use it. You have to learn how to fix it. And then you have to learn how to make it. It's a step-by-step process.
Right.
And yeah, you get to go through the steps a little bit faster because you don't have to make some of the same mistakes. But you can make new mistakes, all of your own. So it's not that great. I mean, Russia stole stuff from us all the time in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and they were consistently behind us. You could say it's a flaw in their system where they simply can't have the same innovation in their industry because they are so tightly controlled. The Chinese also have a controlled economy, but I think they allow more innovation and flexibility than Russia used to.
Right. Yeah, they have a weird mix between quasi-capitalism, very controlled capitalism, but still technically a communist country.
Yeah.
Very controlled, yeah.
So it's Russia, and in terms of the one thing they have in common is neither country minds eating in our beer. If they can come up with ways to do that, then they're totally good with working together. Other than that, they are classic nation states with their own interests, their own requirements, and their own goals. So historically, they were much more closely linked, but I don't think it plays anymore. Communism's changed. Communism is dead in Russia, and goodness knows what Marx would call it in China.
Well, yeah, I think we just hit about a little over 2 hours. We started turning into a pumpkin in about 2 hours. but I mean, that was an amazing podcast.
It was, yeah, and I really, I think Eric too, but I know I can speak for myself. I owe a lot to people like you and Clancy and other people as well that I'll forget to mention.
Oh, you're making me blush. I wish there was a camera you could see. I work at home. I don't get to hear a lot of this stuff normally, so I'm totally cool with hearing. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for coming on. I could talk about this stuff all day.
Yeah,
and I can tell you love to talk about it too. So.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously you don't have any trouble getting me to start talking, and I got to tell you, I love talking about this stuff. And a lot of these questions you ask are about things that I have tried to think about a lot
because you play out in your head, yeah.
Well, it's you write a book about your exit plans about the Iranian nuclear program, shattered tridents about the South China Sea. You want to give a tag to something, what a book is about. Fatal Thunder is about nuclear terrorism, and once you get into that subject, I really feel like I want to get smart on it so I don't make any obvious mistakes.
Right.
I want somebody who's in the business. I mean, Eric, you're a submariner. If you read one of our submarine books, I don't want you throwing it against the wall. Bulkheads. I mean, I don't want you to go, blow ballast tanks full. Well, that's not what they call it, or crash dive. Well, you can't crash dive in a submarine anymore. Things like that. I mean, we want it to feel real. We figure if it feels real to somebody who's actually done it, then we're sure we're giving everybody else an authentic experience.
Yeah, definitely. I got Arctic Gambit on the way. I'll let you know how that turns out.
And I definitely want to look into that. I'm going to pick up that Red Phoenix Burning. I think that would be a really interesting read.
It's kind of a sleeper because we had a deal with Amazon where they were going to give it a big push, and it was going to be published electronically through them. You can get a hard copy; it's print on demand, so no problem there. But you can't go into a bookstore and buy it. So fine, we're okay with this. Well, there was a technical screw up, and this is the unanticipated snafu. There was a we released a single chapter, the first chapter of the book, early, just to sort of get everybody's appetite whetted. Comes the big release date. It's released, everybody gets it, buys it, big sales, and it was only that first chapter. Somehow the rest of the book never got uploaded. And so we got mountains of hate mail from people who thought they were being snookered. And take that, Amazon, and gave the book a 1-star rating.
Oh, man.
Well, it's not Amazon that, okay, and because of that, all those 1-star ratings, and 2-star ratings. So I actually gave us 2 stars. I mean, it's one chapter, but they gave us 2 stars. I wondered about that, but that those low ratings then drove Amazon's algorithms to not
promote it.
To not promote it because the book was doing so poorly in its initial release. Yeah. And we went back and forth with Amazon on this. Oh, no, I still buy stuff off of Amazon, but we're not going to do that again. I'll tell you that.
Huh.
So
that's frustrating.
I'm still yakking. Like I say, I don't get out a lot. It's nice to have people to talk to that are interested in this stuff.
Especially with everything going on, it's hard to get out, and even to bookstores like you're talking about.
Yeah, like when was the last time you browsed in a bookstore? Yeah. That's the way it is.
Oh, I have. I almost forgot to ask you. Someone had a question about Vortex. I own Vortex.
Good for you.
I know a lot of people like it. This one particular person asked if you'd ever get into writing another African alt history book.
Oh God, I would. Well, you got to find a scenario. That's the trick. You got to find something going on. Okay, obviously South Africa was in the news when we were reading that, when we were writing that.
Apartheid and everything.
And the thing is, we were seeing a lot of pushback from conservative Afrikaners who didn't like what was going on. And so Pat Larkin and I, my co-author at that time, we came up with a scenario. We say, okay, so they stage a coup and they try to roll back the clock. I mean, it's very easy to say, and then you build a book based on that premise, as long as the premise is solid. And historically, that kind of thing has happened, never successfully, and it didn't work out in the book either. But it gave us a chance to explore all the stuff that was going on in South Africa. I'll tell you a story about that. We were writing South Africa. We were writing the book. I was working on chapter 5, and P.W. Botha had a stroke. Now, that was like, oh my God, this is a writer's nightmare because the world changed, and how are we going to adapt the book? And what we had to do, we didn't do anything for a little while the South African government sorted itself out. And what scared us was that the guy that they brought in, F.W. de Klerk, was from the Orange Free State. Now, that is the most conservative part of South Africa. That is like deep Afrikaner. I mean, nobody speaks English up there. It's all Afrikaans. And oh my God, they're actually going to roll the clock back because they got this guy in. And it turned out that de Klerk was actually a flaming liberal in South African terms, and he kept the liberalization movement going forward, even accelerated it. One of the things that we had in the original draft, the original outline, as a happy ending was Mandela being released from prison. Okay, he was still in prison at that time. And instead, we put that in the front as one of the things that the government did that got all the conservatives so pissed that they then went and fostered this coup. So you roll with the punches. We didn't have to rewrite that much of the story. Luckily, we're only in chapter 5 and not chapter 18. Thank God. I mean, we always outline everything within an inch of its life. We've got multiple plot lines going in different geographic areas, sometimes minute-to-minute timing, goes across time zones. So I write an outline, and, we write an outline together, passing it back and forth. We beat on it until it refuses to die. And then that's our blocking. And so I know Monday morning when I sit down for a new chapter, what's happening in the chapter, what characters are involved, and by the way, make sure you put the knife under the pillow in chapter 7 because the heroine needs it in chapter 13. That kind of thing. So I'm just other guys do it different ways. Tom would just start at the front and go, it was a dark and stormy night, and then he said he'd let the characters tell him. I couldn't do that. That was genius. Anyways, so it is late. This has been a hoot. Please send me a link when you get this up, and I will put it on my Facebook page. Okay?
Awesome, we'll do.
Definitely, for sure.
Thanks again for joining us. Seriously,
really appreciate it. Yeah, that was an awesome show.
This has been great. If I fumbled or said stuff that was not too good, I'm sorry, but It's what I got.
It was all great.
No, it's perfect.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode. If you want to hang on for 1 second, we'll chat after we close it down here. But that wraps it up for this one.
Yeah, that was it. Okay. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it.